The war on terror has gone on longer than World War I and World War II put together. It has touched 85 countries. It has led to the death of civil liberties within the countries that launched it. It has led to harsher migration policy. It has led to people dying in boats, people dying under freights and falling off of planes. Good riddance to the war on terror and long live peace. Good riddance to the war on terror. 20 years of pain, suffering and misery which could have been avoided and never had to happen. When I saw the scenes unfold in Afghanistan, I saw people falling from planes. I thought of those who fell from planes trying to enter the UK in a time when the cameras weren't on them. I thought of the fact that the United States Army got their dogs out of the country before they got people that they'd worked with. I thought of the possibility that on that plane from which people fell, US Army dogs were probably there. When you look at the history of Afghanistan and the way in which it is intertwined with the history of this country, you are talking about a place which has been the subject of British war 4 times in the last 2 centuries. Starting in 1839, when General Keane marched into Kabul and attempted to impose Shah Shuja upon the Afghan people, with 10,000 troops and £600 a year being given to chiefs to buy Britain's way between Afghanistan and India. The British did not achieve their objectives and were forced to leave in a humiliating march of doom back to India, in which lots of people, mainly the Indian troops that they brought with them, died. Since 1839, Britain has occupied Afghanistan 4 times in the last 2 centuries. In fact, 100 years ago, it was the first country in the world to drop bombs on Afghanistan. In 1919, it was found to drop 332 bombs in 1 single day. What we know is that Britain has no right to Afghanistan. Britain should never have been there, and it should never go back ever again. At the same time, when Britain, through General Keane and local collaborators, were launching a war against Afghanistan in the 1830s and 1840s, they were also selling and forcing the Chinese population to consume opium just next door. They were using opium that they produced in India and forcing it upon the Chinese population. And in fact, after 3 opium wars and the war against the Taiping Rebellion, in which the British fought on both sides, against both sides, and one side was militating to legislate against Britain's trade in opium. Let's not forget that it wasn't until 1917 that China was rid of Britain's trade in opium. The Indians were less fortunate. As recently as 1930, Will Durant found 7,000 cafes run by the British government in India selling opium. The reason why opium is important to our story about Afghanistan is when we look at the development of the situation it is currently in, we cannot forget about the fact that during the time when Afghanistan was subject to Soviet occupation, you had fighters, both local and foreign to Afghanistan, supported by the CIA, coming in to fight the Soviets. During that time, the CIA not only turned a blind eye, but assisted people who were producing opium in Afghanistan and selling it around the world. In fact, you find that during that phase, you had the amount of heroin addicts in Pakistan go from 0 to about 1 million by the end of the time in which the CIA was backing both foreign and local fighters against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. What happened after that is you have a situation where just the year before the US launched the war against Afghanistan, the production of opium was almost brought to zero. However, since the occupation in 2001, not only have you seen Afghanistan now occupy the position of supplying 90% of the world's opium, but you also see a situation where the center for that opium production, the Helmand province, was also home to 10,000 British soldiers and around 140 British military bases. The question has to be asked, what really happened? How did that opium get out of the country and get around the world? What is Britain's issue with selling heroin? What is a greater signifier of US capitalism than the Forbes family? But let's not forget that the Forbes family were one of a few who made their wealth from the opium trade within China off the back of Britain's opium wars. So today, when Forbes magazine prints articles talking about China's secret weakness being opium, there's a lot more to that story than meets the eye. Good riddance to the war on terror. This time of threat inflation and overstated danger has to come to an end. Long live peace. We have seen a period in which something which is estimated to cause about 25,000 deaths a year as maximum estimations, looking at about 50 deaths yearly in the EU and about 10 deaths yearly in the United States. The vast majority of terrorism affects the global south, countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Nigeria, and others. In fact, conservative voices like Baroness Warsi put it this way: 0.5% of all terror attacks affect Western countries. When we look at the threat inflation, which finds a situation where British military expert on terrorism, Chris Hunter, found that you have 1 in 16 million chance of being anywhere near an act of political violence in this country, is somehow made to look like a 1 in 16 chance. And people who are millions of miles away from you are painted as being very close to you and hoping to do you harm. We have to question where this threat inflation and this imbalance comes from. When we look at the amount of people in the world that die from air pollution every year, we're talking about 7 million. We look at the amount of people that die from car crashes every year, you're talking about 1.25 million. Frank Harvey, professor at a US university, argues that you're 4 times more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to die in a terror attack. Why is it that all of this money has gone into fighting something that your chances of dying in are infinitesimal? This perception that imperialism is noble, intentioned, incompetent humanitarian intervention is a major problem. Imperialism is about material realities. It is the way that Britain, when it founded the East India Company in 1655, was able to move a few hundred years later to a place where its GDP had increased by over 300%. When we talk about the Industrial Revolution in this country, we cannot forget that the funding for the invention of the steam train came from Britain's trade in human beings. Manchester, Liverpool, Bristol, London developed off the back of the trade of human beings and the sugar that they were producing. Simultaneous to Britain's industrialization through the building of empire, you also saw the de-development of other societies. When the East India Company was founded, India and China together equaled almost 50% of the global economy. Britain was barely 2% at that time. What we saw was the roles reversing over the next centuries. Britain occupying 14 million miles of the globe means one thing and one thing only. It means that Britain didn't have an empire, Britain was an empire. Occupying Afghanistan 4 times in the last 2 centuries gives Britain the right to go home and never come back. It doesn't give Britain the right to dictate to people in Afghanistan what they should or shouldn't do with their government. Studies of every terrorist organization since 1968 have shown that only 7% of them are defeated by military means. In fact, 10% of them were successful in their struggle, meaning that a higher percentage of terrorist organizations were successful than failed because of military action. On top of that, you also see that 43% of these organizations eventually were part of a political transition. That is what is happening now, and it was quite easy to foresee. Many are going to great lengths to communicate to you how deeply serious the movement of people away from Afghanistan is likely to be. However, what they often fail to mention is that it is estimated that the NATO occupation, the 20-year occupation, which went on longer than World War I and World War II put together, is believed to have caused the existence of 5.3 million Afghan refugees. Overall, the war on terror is believed to have caused 37 million refugees. And actually, on average, it has entailed the dropping of 46 bombs by the US military on a daily basis for 20 years. That is the humanitarian crisis, and we are not going back there. When we look at the war on terror as a force of displacement across the world, and we realize that even across the last 3 years, US counter-terror operations have reached 85 different countries, what we can also see is that the very same governments that are involved in these NATO campaigns are also preventing people seeking asylum in their countries. 35,000 people and over have died trying to get into Europe over the last 30 years. The very same governments, the French government, which was involved in the NATO occupation, the British government, these governments are making it as difficult as physically possible for people from countries like Afghanistan to reach a safe haven. When they talk about giving Afghans a safe passage out of the country now, do remember the fact that of those 35,000 plus people that have died, many of them have been Afghans. The Afghans that have died following their displacement and attempt to enter the EU include Reza Ibrahimi, a 15-year-old child who died at a camp in Lesbos awaiting his chance to experience a new life. Reza Ibrahimi died on the 25th of August 2019. What about Amin Allah and Iftikhar, 18-year-old boys who both died under a freight train trying to get into Europe on the 7th of June 2019? What about Habib Sharoush, who hung himself on the 25th of May 2019 in a refugee camp in Strasbourg? Or what about Ali Reza, the 18-year-old who took his own life in Geneva in a shelter for unaccompanied minors on the 27th of March 2019? I worked in Calais in 2016, and I remember Contrary to popular belief, the majority of people in the camp were not Syrians, they were Afghans. And a lot of them were people that had previously worked as translators for the US and British Army. The question they asked was, how could they have been betrayed in such a way? The truth is that the vast majority of those 35,000 plus people who have died trying to enter Europe remain unnamed to this day. In fact, a 5-year-old Afghan child died being run over by a truck in a refugee camp in Lesbos on the 24th of September 2019. There is a myriad of ways in which these very same governments who are lamenting the perceived humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan are killing people through bureaucratic violence, who are attempting to exit these theatres of war that these same governments have created and enter safe places like Britain, France, and other countries in the EU. And in fact, contrary to this entirely manufactured but seemingly widespread and popular view that actually you help people by invading and bombing them, the truth is you help people by not interfering in their affairs, by learning from history and providing safe passage to asylum. You help people by not haranguing those who rescue people in the sea struggling for life. You help people by not sending journalists to interrogate them in their most desperate moments within the sea. You help people by not demonizing them on the front of newspapers owned by unaccountable offshore capital scumbags like Rupert Murdoch. You help people by understanding that 0.18% of this society are refugees. If they do have the recourse to public funds, which many don't, it is £37.50 per week. Who is the bigger cost to the taxpayer? Someone like Rupert Murdoch, who for 11 years was found to pay barely any corporate tax, who keeps a lot of his money offshore in a very complex web of tax havens, or those people sitting next to you in the waiting room, in hospital, waiting to use the very same services that scumbags like George Osborne eviscerated and tore apart. You have no benefit in believing in their lies of vertical solidarity and horizontal hatred. You have more in common with the people fleeing the bombs paid for by you than you do with the people dropping the bombs paid for by you. US President Dwight Eisenhower coined the phrase the military-industrial complex, and he made the point that for every bit of money that was spent on bombers, you could have spent that same money on pavements, on hospitals, on housing. In fact, a study found that for every $1 billion that was spent on the arms trade, only 11,000 jobs were created. When compared to the amount of jobs that were created in healthcare for every $1 billion spent on it, it was found that around 17,000 jobs were created. And in fact, for education, it was found that for every $1 billion spent on it, 26,000 jobs were created. Here we clearly see that this misallocation of funds towards war, towards demonizing, towards carceral situations, we know that that money could have been better spent housing people, treating people, giving people their own human rights here. Housing, healthcare, and education are human rights, not privileges. Do not allow the war industry to lead you to believe otherwise. War is not a human right. There are those that say the US spent trillions, and where did it go? All for nothing. You know where it went? It went into the bank accounts of some of the most wealthiest people in the world. It went into Veritas Capital. It went to Eric Prince, formerly of Blackwater. It went to companies like Kellogg Brown and Root. It went to Dick Cheney's Halliburton. It went to Lockheed Martin, who within days of the announcement of the Afghan war got one of the largest no-bid contracts in US history. It just so happened that 6 of their senior executives populated the Bush administration. This war, as it always is, was a transfer of wealth upwards. Robin Hood in reverse. War is a scam. Another example from the Matt Hancock Handbook of Crocodile Tears has to be Ben Wallace. When he was asked why he has a special appreciation for those left behind by this exit from Afghanistan, he croaked up saying it was because he was a soldier. Well, you know what else he was? He was the overseas director of Kinetic, an arms company which benefited handsomely from the occupation of Afghanistan. Not only selling military hardware to the United States, to the US, to the British, and also to the Dutch governments, all specially made for their occupation of Afghanistan. The question has to be asked if he was not just the overseas director, but also potentially a shareholder in this company. And if he was, did he derive any personal benefit from the occupation of Afghanistan? Another disingenuous actor could be seen to be Tobias Ellwood. He has been particularly animated upon this subject of the exit of Afghanistan, describing it as the lowest point in British foreign policy for many, many years. Well, this supposed representative of public interests is not only an MP, but he's also a Lieutenant General in the British Army's Psychological Warfare Unit, the 77th Brigade. He also has received donations from the Conservative Friends of Israel. Britain is well documented in having extensive military and intelligence relationships with the State of Israel. He's also received donations directly from the Saudi Arabian government. As we know, Saudi Arabia, with the essential help from the British government and BAE Systems and the Ministry of Defence, has launched a genocidal war on the people of Yemen. Perhaps Tobias Ellwood, Ben Wallace, this is not the time in which their opinions count much. When you look at Britain's development as an economic power, it was based on the de-development and the de-emphasizing and the cancelling of other nations. Today is a time when the 20 fastest growing economies in the world, none of them are European, and several of them are former British colonies. Britain is projected to fall out of the top 10 economies in the world over the next 10 to 20 years. That change will mean that those like Ben Wallace and Tobias Ellwood and much of the British media who have opinions well beyond their means when it comes to global politics have to take a back seat. Perhaps it's time for us to not see Britain as having a role in militarily occupying the rest of the world. It's known that Britain has a tax haven network responsible for 37% of all tax losses that governments around the world face. But we also know that Britain has around 150 military bases around the world, including in the 5 countries around China. They've also been involved in 7 covert wars over the past decade. It's time for a new way of interacting with the rest of the world. It's time for honesty about the effects of British foreign policy historically. It's also time for honesty about how Britain found itself to be the world's #1 economy in what was quite the aberration of human history. Perhaps we are heading to a time where the economic equilibrium will return more to a natural order. That means Britain taking a back seat. No more colonialism, no more imperialism, No more military adventures. That time is done. Afghanistan is not the property of the United States and the UK. The United States is due to be overtaken as the world's #1 economy by 2026, according to Goldman Sachs. The UK is due to fall out of the world's top 10 economies within the next 10 to 20 years. It is time that people in the US and Britain understood that they have no right to dictate who can or can't be the government of any other country. When people talk about humanitarianism as being a driver for British foreign policy, I think of a conversation which Jason Davidson recounts between him and a senior officer within British intelligence. Jason Davidson quotes him in the following way: "The human rights side becomes part of public rationale, but it's not a driver of decision. It is always helpful for governments who want to get the Guardian readers of the world on board to have a humanitarian logic. It has never been a driver of decision." The United States exited Afghanistan the way it came, killing at least 3 people in Kabul airport in an unaccountable show of force. The question I ask is why, when it's clear that civilians were killed by the US military in Kabul airport, was this constantly referred to by all of the English language media almost in the passive voice? Is it the case that English language media seems to be the last bastion of Anglo-American dominance, even when facts on the ground are no longer in their favour, where military might is no longer the vehicle through which the United States is able to impose its will on people? Do we see that reality warped, twisted, and sanitized for public consumption? PR is the last stand of this empire, it seems. We can't forget that this was a war of choice. When the United States announced that they wanted Osama bin Laden, the government in Afghanistan were quite clear. They were willing, under specific conditions, to provide him to be judged in a court of law. The United States were not even happy for him to go to The Hague. They wanted military action. Did that have something to do with the fact that within George Bush's administration, there were 6 senior executives at Lockheed Martin, a company which has benefited massively from the war on terror, not only through the selling of arms, but also through the providing of interrogators at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib? Remember that this war, which has lasted 2 decades, has entailed the costs of about $6.4 trillion. The Afghan war, as a part of the war on terror, has cost not only almost $250,000 lives, but it cost the US government $2.26 trillion. The year in which war was announced on Afghanistan, the US government took 33 million classified actions and spent $5.5 billion that year alone to keep those classified documents secure. These are what Donald Rumsfeld referred to as the unknown unknowns. Peter Gallison, in the book Agnotology, The Production of Ignorance, in fact hazards that the classified world is larger than the declassified world, meaning there is far more information which is kept from us than all of the books in all of the libraries of the world. Now, when a CIA-backed program like 24 depicted an imitation of Julian Assange working alongside terrorists to harm the United States, you have to question what this production of a space of rightlessness means when we talk about the terrorist. Throughout the war on terror, you have seen habeas corpus rendered an irrelevance. You have seen the possibility of a child in British schools learning about the importance of the Magna Carta to British history. Simultaneously, they could have a family member deprived of the right to see the evidence held against them, not being judged by a jury of their peers, being detained indefinitely, and being prosecuted in a secret court. That child could also simultaneously get questioned by British police without the presence or knowledge of their parents under the prevent duty. The very ideals which this country professes to hold have clearly been completely discredited and contradicted by the war on terror. You've also seen people detained indefinitely in Guantanamo Bay without any charge whatsoever. WikiLeaks revealed that 2 children between the ages of 13 and 14 were detained by US forces in Guantanamo Bay. They also revealed that 3 15-year-olds were detained in Guantanamo Bay. This was something that the US government was not admitting. So WikiLeaks also revealed that Yasser Talal al-Sahrani was detained at Guantanamo at the age of 17. No trial, no legal process. He killed himself in his cell at Guantanamo Bay at the age of 21. These are some of the unknown unknowns that Donald Rumsfeld spoke about. Another person who has done much to reveal them is Daniel Hale, who showed that 90% of victims of the US drone program were actually innocent bystanders and completely uninvolved with any military activity. Daniel Hale has paid the price and will be sent to jail on the charge of espionage. So at a time where we have seen the main patriarchs of the war on terror, George Bush and Tony Blair, relentlessly rehabilitated and in fact oracleized as sources of wise adult in the room kind of wisdom for politics, we simultaneously see those who have revealed the war crimes of these war criminals demonized, spat upon, cursed, imprisoned, and ignored completely. This is how they monsterize the humans and humanize the monsters. But Bush and Blair are not the only monsters of this period. We can't forget that the Obama administration awarded a $250 million contract to Eric Prince's academy, the latest insinuation of Blackwater. Of course, Blackwater killed many civilians in Iraq and were captured on camera doing so. In fact, at the beginning of this year, it was found that there were still 18,000 private military contractors in Afghanistan. Those contractors are largely unaccounted for and unaccountable. Where are they now? The Afghan war logs for which Julian Assange seems to be paying the price with his life today in a cold cell in Belmarsh prison revealed torture, death squads, rendition, individual killings, but also group killings. It also reveals that at one point, the former president of Afghanistan, put in place by the United States, Hamid Karzai, whose own brother was identified as the most established runner of heroin within Afghanistan during the time that his brother was president, had interactions with the US government showing that they were actually giving £1,500 to victims, families that they had killed. He described in private communication with the United States as a cheapening. He described this in communications with the United States as a cheapening of Afghan lives. We see that on March 21st, 2007, CIA paramilitaries shot a mute, deaf man. Shum Khan was shot by the US forces, despite not being able to understand what they were saying to him. We also see documents of how US Special Forces launched 6 different 2,000-pound bombs on a compound just because they were looking for one quote-unquote high-value individual. While they claimed the victims of this strike were Taliban, local people say that this attack on the compound killed 300 civilians. We also see evidence that the United States pursued a policy of psychological warfare against the Afghan population, not only by setting up media organizations, but placing news stories constructed by them on Afghan radio stations and TV stations. We see 2 good examples of this being Radio Ghaznawiyan and Waqt News Agency, both being directed in terms of coverage of issues by the US military. What does this mean for the military influence on people's ideas, not only in Afghanistan, but even in the rest of the world? Is nothing sacred? It's great that the world is concerned about the human rights of people in Afghanistan, but where have you been? Literally, where have you been for the last 20 years? The New York Times describes Veritas Capital as technically the 2nd largest military contractor in Iraq and Afghanistan. One of the military contractors it owns is DynCorp. Well, DynCorp, prior to the invasion of Afghanistan, was found that 14 of its employees were trading in sex slaves who were children in Bosnia. The people that reported this were instantly fired, and the 14 people that were found to be doing this faced no punishment. However, following the occupation of Afghanistan, this Veritas Capital owned firm got huge contracts in Afghanistan, and unfortunately they were again revealed to be hiring child, male and female prostitutes within Afghanistan. When we talk about this, it's not as if it's some rogue company. Veritas Capital, who owned DynCorp, had a paid advisory role for Richard Armitage, who was the Deputy Secretary of State in the US government. They also had several high-ranking military figures on their paid advisory council. How is it possible that in both these situations, this organization faced zero accountability? And what we then see is the US ambassador reporting back to the US government about this problem of DynCorp contractors partaking in these activities. How can these invaders be a vehicle for any form of liberation? This idea of liberation through occupation exists only in the imagination of MOD-influenced journalists. The facts are these: desecrations of human bodies after death is something which the Geneva Conventions clearly outlawed. However, US Marines were found to be urinating on the bodies of people that the English language media obediently described as Taliban fighters. However, the Taliban spokesman came out and said these Afghans were killed by mortars and then urinated upon by US forces. Rather than facing any type of judicial punishment, these people were dealt with internally to the US military, with even Joseph Chamberlain, one of them, saying that he would do it again. And asked if he regretted it, he said, hell no. He went on to publish a book by the name of Into Infamy, a Marine Sniper's War. Is this liberation? On the UK side of things, let's not forget the word of General Dannett, who currently sits in the House of Lords. He said, we probably wound up, and maybe still are, killing a lot of farmers. Those who heroically resisted this occupation were the people of Afghanistan. They may not be those that you see on the news, and they may not be those that the New York Times and the Washington Post are interested to speak to, but they stood up and they defended themselves from the world's most powerful military which has ever existed in human history. So how is it that Britain can look itself in the mirror and claim that it was doing this to defend human rights, when even the ICC has gone as far as to say there is a reasonable basis to believe that Britain committed war crimes? When those who are scratching their head of how this happened come to think about it, they should look at the words of Sherrod Cooper-Coles, a former British diplomat in Afghanistan and employee of BAE Systems. He claimed 60% of Afghan National Police who took part in the training sessions with the British tested negative when checked for opiate consumption. Here we see the policy of allowing opiate production in the Helmand province not only having negative ramifications on the streets of Philadelphia and Birmingham, but also having negative ramifications for the very society that this economy was part of. Another clue as to why things went the way they did upon the exit of NATO forces is contained in David Miliband's reporting of his trip to Afghanistan while foreign minister. He asked two of the ministers how long they thought the capital of Helmand would withstand the Taliban following British and NATO exit. He was told by the two ministers 24 hours. This was around 10 years ago. The fact is the NATO occupation was propping up what is perceived to be one of the most corrupt governments in the world. The Afghan police, not only seemingly being part of a societal problem of drug use, also seem to have sold territory in some cases to the Taliban. We also know that the political system established by the NATO occupation was not as convincing as some would have you believe. In the last election, only 2 million people took part. That is out of a population of 36 million people. That is not participatory democracy. Maybe now is not the time for the deep contemplative think pieces in somber tones from the people that marched us into this. Now is the time in which those of us who campaigned year after year against these industrial massacres led by NATO to be clearly understood to have been vindicated by what has happened. Even within your own tortured logic in the service of power, you have failed. Humble yourselves. Now is the time for humility and accountability on the part of the warmongers and hope for the rest of us. Overall, as we've established, far more people are dying because of climate change and pollution than they are because of terrorism. It is a well-documented fact that the United States military is a bigger polluter than 140 countries and spends more than the next 7 countries put together on its military budget. Therefore, the US military is a bigger threat to you and to Afghans than the Taliban could ever be. Simultaneous to spending $650 million per year subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, the US government only spends 0.2% of its annual budget on the US Environmental Protection Agency. When we think about the fact that across the world, governments combined spend $5.5 trillion annually on subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, our future cannot be defined by warfare and enemies. We have to find a way in which humanity can come together to survive the major destabilization which climate change will bring.